Thank you again for joining us, and Amy, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Katerina. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the seminar today. So as Katerina said, I recently submitted my PhD thesis, and this seminar will be focusing on the research I conducted with Countryside Stewardship Facilitation Fund groups in England. So first, here's a brief overview of the presentation. I'll introduce the main policy context and the Countryside Stewardship Facilitation Fund itself, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the scheme. Then I'll outline my main aim and objectives, give an overview of the key literature I used in the research, then go into my methodology in a bit more detail, before focusing on the findings of the research and the contributions to research policy and practice. So agri-environment schemes have been employed in England since the 1980s to encourage farmers to protect and enhance the natural environment. However, this has largely been at the single farm scale. Lawton et al.'s Space for Nature report presented a stark picture for England's natural environment and called for bigger, better and joined up approaches to its care. And this in turn prompted DEFRA's white paper, The Natural Choice Securing the Value of Nature, which included a commitment at the time to nature improvement areas. And this commitment was important because the development of the Countryside Stewardship Facilitation Fund can be attributed to learning from the nature improvement areas. And subsequent policy developments have continued to position farmer and land manager cooperation or working together as essential for achieving environmental improvements. And this, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, continues to the present day as the environmental land management scheme is being developed. So we're seeing, particularly with the landscape recovery, that emphasis on collaboration for landscape scale improvement. But today we'll be looking at the Countryside Stewardship Facilitation Fund. And so thinking about what it can teach us, not only about the importance of natural connections, but also social connections. So the Countryside Stewardship Facilitation Fund has been running since 2015. The most recent review of the facilitation funds, which was completed by the CCRI, found that there were 177 groups of farmers and land managers, and in the 136 groups that were created from 2015 to 2020, there were 3,330 members in 2021, covering a total area of just over 800,000 hectares. And you can see on the slide there, apologies for the slightly blurry graphic, but that is the distribution of facilitation funds across England. So making really good progress and kind of joining up as well. You can see there that there's a lot of facilitation funds that sit by another. And I know that there are some cases where facilitation groups have been working together to see how they can improve things at an even greater scale than the individual group level. So farmers and land managers are working together with the help of a dedicated facilitator to improve the natural environment at a landscape rather than a single holding scale. And so the facilitator is there to provide support in aligning management options across individual countryside stewardship agreements, and also is responsible for looking out for funding that can support groups in carrying out landscape scale restoration projects, such as in wetland habitats. And the group's aims are diverse, as you'd expect from the different farming types and the different environmental issues that are faced across England. But a commonality is their focus on the countryside stewardship priorities for their area. And there is evidence from all of the reviews that have been conducted for Natural England and DEFRA that the Facilitation Fund mechanism delivers both environmental and social change. And this can support the delivery of collaborative elements of the environmental land management scheme. The Facilitation Fund itself will continue to be supported for a few more years, so potential facilitators can still apply for funding, and the most recent round has just been confirmed. And facilitation will hopefully become a part of the environmental land management scheme offer too. So now I'll move on to the main aim and objectives of my specific research. So with the increasing emphasis on working together for environmental change in England's agricultural policy, I felt it was important to understand the conditions required for this to occur. And so what better place to start than the Countryside Stewardship Facilitation Fund? Specifically, I wanted to know how social capital developed in the groups, how this affected people's willingness to engage in the combination and exchange of intellectual capital or knowledge, and finally, how these two forms of capital, social and intellectual, influence people's decisions to get involved in collective action, working together for the delivery of environmental gains at the landscape scale. So first, I think it's important to understand, what is social capital? So it is a contested topic or concept, as many disciplines have used it, and there are broad definitions and also different ways of measuring social capital. But Pretty and Ward argue that it is a prerequisite for improving natural capital. So if we're thinking about environmental improvements on the landscape scale, then clearly improving social capital is also really important. So social capital has been widely used in research on farming, and Woolcock draws together the definition that you can see on the slide here. It is the norms and networks that facilitate collective action. So clearly very important in getting people working together. Theoretical integrity is retained as authors focus on the importance of social relationships and the key concepts which contribute to the maintenance of social capital. It's important to note that although social capital has many benefits, which hopefully you'll see throughout the rest of this presentation, it does have a dark side too. So for example, those with whom we share social ties may just as easily constitute a negative influence on us. And groups with high levels of social capital may not be open to others joining, or they may not be open to sharing information with other groups. And equally, where people lack social capital, they may become isolated. And this is perhaps a significant issue in farming, where we have been seeing research come out on harder to reach farmers, for example. And so I decided to employ Nahapiet and Ghoshal's dimensional framework in my research, which you can now see on the screen. So I chose this framework because it draws together several sociological concepts into an analytical framework. So to make sure that I was capturing several different facets of social capital and how they influenced people's willingness to share knowledge. And also later on in the presentation, you'll see how they also influenced people's willingness and capacity to engage in collective action. So the framework is seen here. I appreciate that it's quite cluttered, but essentially all the facets you see on the left-hand side of the framework contribute in some way to people's willingness and access to intellectual capital. And Nahapiet and Ghoshal suggest that through those four boxes in the combination and exchange of intellectual capital, we see new intellectual capital created, and that there's also this feedback loop back into social capital where people are exchanging knowledge, and so they're also kind of contributing to a change in narratives or a change in norms. So we see that feedback loop, and again, that's developed later in this presentation. So their work focuses on the firm, but they do suggest that work could be done with groups of all kinds, providing that they have a boundary and a clear focus, which the Facilitation Fund groups on the whole do. So I used this framework as a guide and looked in more detail at literature on social capital in farming and rural areas, searching for each of the facets in the three dimensions. So for example, the influence of network ties and network configuration of social capital, the importance of shared codes and narratives in farming, and the influence of trust, social norms, obligations, and identities, particularly of those relating to the good farmer. And I explored knowledge exchange, including the types of knowledge shared and factors influencing knowledge exchange. And finally, I considered how facets of social capital and the forms of learning I'd read about could contribute to creating conditions for collective action. So though collective action is not included in Nahapiet and Ghoshal's framework, part of my analysis was to consider how social and intellectual capital could contribute and further extend the framework for use in work at a landscape scale. So with my literature review complete, I turn to finalising my methodological approach, which you can see on the screen here. My PhD was conducted in, well, right in the middle of COVID. So reaching this methodological approach, it happened over a few iterations. So these findings that I'm talking about today are drawn from research with 4 case study groups and comprised semi-structured interviews with 21 group members, 4 facilitators, and 4 members of staff with environmental NGOs that have worked with the Facilitation Fund group. So it's quite important to have that network, because that is something that the Facilitation Fund is really aiming for. It's to get people, farmers and land managers, involved with other actors in the sector to really kind of get that network of people working together on landscape scale improvements. I also carried out participant observation at 6 group events. 5 of these were in person and 1 was online. And although I obviously hadn't anticipated it, this online in-person distinction would turn out to be a significant element of my work, given the pandemic conditions. The research itself was conducted from July 2021 to November 2021, after approval for in-person fieldwork was granted by the university. And this final approach was informed by information I'd gathered actually throughout the lockdowns, including interviews with facilitators and an internship with the Wales Centre for Public Policy. The facilitator interviews in particular demonstrated the importance of continued in-person communication for Facilitation Fund groups, but also demonstrated some of the innovative approaches that groups had taken to continuing to meet with one another in compliance with COVID regulations. So having smaller group meetings, making sure they're outside, walking, and also to meeting online. And some people had great success with hosting Zoom meetings, and also, plant IDs through Zoom. One facilitator was really positive about the feedback she'd had from this online Zoom plant identification course, which saw people out and about on their phones, all on Zoom together, learning about different types of plants. And my internship gave me an opportunity to work on another case study with Welsh farmers, and this was completely remote. But that was important as it allowed me to develop my telephone interviewing skills, which were essential for my PhD research, and also to appreciate further the issues that farmer groups were facing throughout the lockdowns. And so I decided that I'd offer my participants their choice of interview mode, so in person, telephone, or virtual, to ensure they were comfortable taking part and could take part in the research if they wanted to do so. And so where participants were happy to speak with me in person, I visited their farm or their land, and others expressed a preference for speaking virtually or over the phone. And this difference in interview modes presented an opportunity for reflection on how forms of interaction can affect the information we share and receive. So before I go into the findings of the research, I'm just going to reflect on my experiences and my participants' experiences of the different interview modes, just to think about how they are affecting the data that we collect. So on the screen here, you'll see some advantages and disadvantages of the 3 interview modes that I used for this research. And although my data collection did take a somewhat different form than I'd imagined when I first started my PhD, the process of adaptation provided a valuable learning experience for future research projects. And I hope that in the future I can continue to ensure the research I do conduct is resilient to unexpected issues and events. So for a long time, face-to-face interviews have been considered the gold standard for capturing qualitative data owing to their emplacement. Being there offers the opportunity to learn far more from non-verbal cues and also visible inspection of farm practices and how people create the places they inhabit. So the image on this slide, for example, walking through a field of rushes gave me a great understanding of what was to come later that day when I attended a rush management event with one of my farmer groups. And I wouldn't have necessarily had this appreciation had I not been there in person, walking through and seeing the extent to which rushes affected some of these fields. However, there are practical issues to consider with in-person interviews, especially in farming, including participant and researcher safety. Of course, this was exacerbated by the potential for spreading COVID-19. And I found that given the time that I hadn't been conducting in-person research, I was also quite apprehensive in going out into the field myself for the first time. However, my participants were very welcoming and I quickly found that I was okay doing in-person interviews. Telephone interviews have grown in popularity as more people have access to personal telephones now. And for many farmers, they're the preferred option because they're used to just picking up the phone anyway. It can be done anytime, anywhere, and they're very easy to reschedule if something should come up on the farm. Although they may lack the rich detail and the lack of visual cues, so you're unsure whether people maybe are completely focused on the interview, telephone interviews did produce data of comparable quality. And given that I'd had experience of conducting the telephone interviews, I was happy to do them and I'd consider employing them again. And I think that remains a popular option with participants. And finally, virtual interviews were new to me, as I think they were for many of us in 2020 and 2021. And I'd had experience of using Zoom and Teams for calls with colleagues, but I hadn't used the platforms for interviews. Prior to working with the facilitators in the summer of 2020, who were great in giving me their time to discuss how the pandemic had influenced their groups. They have a little more in common with the in-person interview, as you can see people kind of responding on the screen, and also the flexibility of telephone interviews. But they do retain some issues, in particular, obtaining a secure connection. And I did have one occasion where a participant and I had to revert to a telephone call because they were struggling with their internet connection. And interestingly, and something that I hadn't considered for virtual or telephone was people were saying that they had chosen a virtual interview as it presented an opportunity to address the carbon emissions associated with travel for in-person interviews. I'm sure that's probably an issue that research projects will be addressing in the future. But for now, we'll turn back to the Facilitation Fund and my participants' experiences of the scheme. So my findings can be split into two parts: the role of social and intellectual capital in developing a group, and the role of group events in maintaining and enhancing social capital and providing a space in which intellectual capital may be exchanged. So this first slide here focuses on that process of group development. So the facilitator is a key individual. They play an essential role in setting the facilitation group up. They must submit the application on behalf of their group members. And in doing so, they must demonstrate their expertise and also then their networks, their access to potential members, their access to experts who would be able to speak on a range of topics related to countryside stewardship. And their network ties in particular were vital because it allowed people to draw together these groups very quickly, which was important because the application process were often over very short timescales. And facilitators remained a central node in each group, regardless of the age of the group. So I worked with 2 groups who were funded in 2020, 1 funded in 2015, and 1 funded in 2016. And regardless of their age, the facilitator remained absolutely key, and became a trusted contact through whom group members could access support and knowledge. And the facilitators themselves, their knowledge of each of the individual businesses with whom they were working was incredible. And you could really see that they had been able to link group members and experts and other partners based on their knowledge of each individual group member. And I found that membership initially depends on the presence of bonding ties. So these are close ties with people with whom we share characteristics and which are characterized by high levels of trust. And these initial ties can prevent knowledge exchange, but with skilled facilitation, it's possible to overcome this issue and make full use of the potential of bridging ties. And participants found that joining the group gave them access to knowledge that they may not have otherwise had. And they also considered it a benefit in that they had a collective voice with which to influence policy. Social norms had an impact on membership. So I didn't seek to speak with people who were not members of facilitation fund groups, but plenty of participants were talking about others that they knew in the area who weren't sure about joining or who said they would never join. And a lot of this came down to social norms. People were unwilling to join the group because it didn't align with their vision for the farm. Someone said, you know, oh, my neighbor needs their grass growing all the time for the cows, you know, otherwise they just never get by. And others who were saying that their peers who they'd been to agricultural college with in the 60s and 70s had only known production and were unsure how to really change or what they could contribute to a group that was in some ways perceived to be very conservationist, and that I'll come on to that later. And time and economic capital also came out as important considerations here. For some, you know, that tension between production and conservation and balancing those things, they just, you know, they needed support in understanding what that would mean for their business in order to actually take that step and join a facilitation fund group. And finally, in the early stages of developing a group, it's essential that facilitators and group members can work together to develop a shared understanding of the expectations of the group, what each individual must do as a member, so what the facilitators and their peers' expectations are of them being a member of the group. For example, the Northern Farmers group that I worked with were working together to improve the water quality of the river shown on the slide here, along with a few other things. And they need to understand how they're going to do that together. So it may be that they've been doing things on their own farm for several years to do their bit to contributing to improving water quality, for example. But the key thing that the facilitation funds are aiming for is that everyone is doing that work together. So we're aligning work across farms and even encouraging people to work together, to communicate regularly, to really do the best that they can for improving water quality, improving habitat connectivity, and several other countryside stewardship priorities. And one facilitator said that they found it useful to develop a shared narrative to which her group members could refer. She likened pollinators' needs to that of our own, so shelter, food, and encouraged her members to think, what are the basics that you need? And how do you think you could provide those things for pollinators? And that was really successful. She now finds that both her group members and the partners they're working with are referring to the big four things that pollinators need and the things that farmers and land managers can provide for them. So that's group development, developing those ties, getting people involved, starting to build that trust, and helping people to understand what being part of a facilitation fund group might mean for them. The next thing is group events. So the pandemic obviously had an impact on the events that groups were able to hold. As I mentioned, some very successfully moved online, others had an enforced pause. So particularly the 2020 groups I spoke to, they really struggled to get people online. They'd only had a few months of funding, and they hadn't really got going. So getting people online, joining Zoom calls or Teams calls was really quite difficult. In this slide here, this picture is actually one of the first group events that the East Farmer group that I worked with had actually been able to hold in person. And so this was a really important time for the people who were attending to actually meet people for the first time, to kind of gauge, who might I be working with, who can I trust, are our visions going to align here? And so it was great to see. And with the East Farmers group, I had an experience both online and offline at a group event, and to see the conversation happening in person when, online, most people had their cameras off because of connectivity issues, and there was very limited conversation. To actually see people walking together, having a chat, be it farming related or not, was really fantastic. And I think it just demonstrates the importance of continued in-person events and interactions. So facilitators described how building topics of demonstrable value to farming businesses was important, and often improved attendance. So for example, the Northern Farmers Facilitator recalled a neighbouring group advertising an event that was mainly focused on a talk from the wool board and how they could, maybe improve prices for their wool. But they'd also reserved some time at the end of that session for the group partner who I spoke with to discuss countryside stewardship, and to also, get people thinking about the benefits of countryside stewardship alongside increased prices for wool. And participants, group members were saying to me that if they thought that an event wasn't going to be of interest or relevance, then they just wouldn't attend, because group in-person events in particular represent a significant investment of time. And that, again, is very important. Holding an event at a time which works for everyone is probably impossible. But there were some things that facilitators said they considered to make sure that they could get as many people along as possible. So for example, if an event was held in the day, it was unlikely to be attended by many full-time farmers, as they were often attending to tasks on their farm. So there was a preference for events held over lunch, as they felt that that would be a time when they'd be taking a break anyway. And also in the evenings when it was dark and they could meet over dinner. So obviously there's some recognition that you do need to go to some events when it's light and you can see the issues at hand. However, having an event in the evening, particularly over dinner, was something that people felt they'd be more able to commit to. In terms of the findings on in-person and online events, as it says here, in-person events were preferred, but there were significant advantages to both in-person and online events. Online events particularly, for those people who could access them in terms of a reliable broadband connection, they were important. That improved accessibility. It meant that they could, maybe be listening to it while they were out and about on the farm, or they could be watching it or catching up on a recording. And it also allowed facilitators to bring in speakers from their wider networks. So the East farmers had a call from someone that the group members said to me, oh, they'd never come here. It's far too, we're far too far away for them. But we actually managed to speak with these people and they told us about what they were doing, and we'd never have had that if Zoom and Teams hadn't been a thing. But online events also presented significant issues, mainly regarding communication. So as we're hearing today, really, the focus is on one speaker, and there's little opportunity for informal interaction between attendees. Often as well, given shaky broadband connections, people would have to keep their cameras off. And if they did turn their microphone on, their speech might be broken up and difficult to understand. And so this had implications for the development of trusting relationships, and particularly meant that the 2020 groups found it difficult to make progress between periods of lockdown, because they struggled to meet people. And as I mentioned, some people were completely unable to access online events. And I think this is a really important consideration. If we're moving towards more digital services, we need to remember that there are still people who cannot access services online, and this really should be taken into account. So in-person events were preferred by most participants, largely because, well, for the 2020 groups, they could meet new people for the first time. They could actually have a chat with their group members. And also for those who were hosting an event, they were able to receive tailored advice from experts, be that on improvements for grassland management, improving conditions for dung beetles or for bats. Holding the event on their farm meant that they got some tailored advice. Now, this is important because the Facilitation Fund scheme does not include funding for the provision of one-to-one advice. So the fact that people could hold an event on their farm and get that slightly tailored advice they found was really important. And actually seeing others having success with new practices was a motivation for several participants. And also, having seen it, they were then able to discuss it over a meal or a coffee at the end of the event as well. So they were able to get a bit of advice and go away and maybe think about how it might work for them on their land. And crucially, in-person interaction was more conducive to developing relationships based on trust and reciprocity. So again, this event that's on here, it poured down about halfway through the walk, and there were people sharing waterproofs, sharing umbrellas. We were all huddled under a tree, and it was just a great opportunity for people again to kind of meet other people, and also to understand that, okay, this person lent me their waterproof. It's a topic of conversation for another time. And you could see people kind of, once that initial, oh, do you mind if I share your umbrella? There was that conversation starting. So unexpected things often led to conversations that people could then go away and think, oh, I remember so-and-so is doing this, maybe I'll get on the phone. And so comments on group events were largely positive, but there were some issues, particularly with participants kind of worried about what people might say if they welcomed them onto their farm, kind of nitpicking at issues related to their management. And that's something that takes time to overcome. For people to be willing to let people onto their land is something that takes time to overcome, and that's something that I'll come back to shortly. And finally, as I mentioned, experts were usually on hand at every event. And it gave people the opportunity to hear about different topics that they may or may not have considered before joining the event. Importantly, facilitators were able to endorse the experts, and where events were held in person, it was an opportunity for group members to have a chat again with the expert to say, oh yeah, you showed us this, this is my situation, how do you think it might work for me? And though despite the experts being well received and people had lots of positive comments about them in the interviews I conducted, there was limited evidence that people were committing to making changes based on their talks. One farmer mentioned that he'd explored a website further based on the talk that the expert had given, but there are other barriers that remain regarding implementation, such as a lack of clarity over what practices they'll be paid to implement and what funding will be available for collective action. So there's that broader question over what is next for farming in England? What is the environmental land management scheme going to look like in terms of those collaborative elements? And so the following slides speak to the research questions. So research question 1, how do each of Nahapiet and Ghoshal's dimensions of social capital manifest in facilitation fund groups? So first and foremost, the facilitation fund represents an intentional investment in developing network ties. So the facilitator has to draw together a group of individuals in order to make that application. However, in terms of the development of other facets, such as trust and shared norms and identities, the length of funding provided to groups was considered to be too short for any significant change to occur. That said, where there was pre-existing social capital, as I mentioned, that influenced participants' decisions to become involved in the facilitation fund, particularly levels of trust. However, that does create some issues around, as I mentioned before, that dark side of social capital, where if we see groups with high levels of bonding social capital, others may be slightly reluctant to join because they can see that there's already quite a well-established group and they're not sure how they might fit in. And having said that, group membership is diverse. So in each of the groups I spoke to, there were people, describing themselves as full-time farmers, as part-time farmers, as hobby farmers, as smallholders. Some people were just interested in being part of the group because they were part of a local conservation group. And so there's diversity, but that does foreground the tension between production and engagement in environmentally beneficial practices. So group members were able to discuss their varying views, but I still saw this reluctance for some people to get involved in conversations because they weren't sure with how their vision fit with that of others. So regarding their business needs or how their farm might fit into that landscape scale collective action. And again, that's where the facilitator comes in, someone who can frame the key issues and guide discussion. So that's why the events are really important, because it gives people that time to kind of positively discuss varying views and how they might reach a consensus on how to go forwards. And again, just to really kind of emphasize the importance of that facilitator role. As I've said, through people developing shared narratives and identities, the literature shows that that is essential. And so research question 2 was focused on intellectual capital and knowledge exchange. And as Nahapiet and Ghoshal's framework suggests, the relational dimension of social capital, so that's trust and norms and identity, it has a significant impact on levels of knowledge exchange. As I've said, the structural dimension, so those network ties and the configuration, has to be well developed for the application to even go in. But encouraging people that have been brought together to share their knowledge relies on building trusting relationships across various identities. So for example, some participants were unwilling to share knowledge when they didn't trust their peers. And this was often directly affected by how they identified themselves. So people who were saying, oh, I'm a full-time farmer, I'm a commercial farmer, didn't perhaps trust those they considered to be incomers, people who had bought land, people who might be farming part-time. And they felt it difficult to share information with others because they felt it was sensitive information about their business, and they hadn't yet had time to develop trusting relationships with other group members. And importantly, I think particularly given the amount of documentation we've had, policy document after policy document, the cognitive dimension also had an impact on people's willingness and understanding. Too often, group members didn't share the same understanding of the language used in policy documents, which led to confusion and an inability to identify how they could usefully share knowledge on important topics. So, for example, the word improvement means different things to different people, depending on what their perception is of what is good for their land. Events serve as an important opportunity for knowledge exchange and relationship development, and in-person events were considered irreplaceable. People felt that they could, through experiencing what other people were doing, it gave them a greater appreciation of what they could be doing on their land and how it might work for them. Also, time for informal discussion over coffee, cake, or lunch was an opportunity to develop trust and also to really to reduce isolation for some people and also to deliver well-being benefits. People found that they could actually share their concerns in what is an uncertain and difficult time. So having those in-person events was important. And although online events were appreciated, and we've seen that improvements in technology have been heralded for their potential to improve and provide digital extension services, when it comes to actually kind of that sharing of knowledge between people, particularly at a group level, if you want to encourage that interaction between individuals in a specific area, actually doing things online isn't necessarily conducive to sharing knowledge, particularly for those with a shaky broadband connection, and also because it foregrounds the kind of one or two people speaking as opposed to a kind of more discussion-based event. And finally, research question 3, to what extent has social and intellectual capital development in facilitation fund groups facilitated collective action for the delivery of landscape scale environmental outcomes? You may have realized that based on the content of this presentation thus far, that there was limited evidence of collective action for landscape scale environmental change. Some participants described forms of cooperation, which were useful from a business perspective, such as sharing machinery, but there was little commitment to working together to deliver specific landscape scale changes. And so I found that while people were open to working together, collective action requires favourable conditions similar to those required for the exchange of intellectual capital, including high levels of trust and a shared vision. And so I use these findings to update the dimensional framework, and apologies again for that. There's quite a lot of arrows there, but the section in blue you can see is an addition to the framework. So the relational, structural and cognitive dimensions remain, and the facets in bold were found to be the most influential in this research. And arrows have been included here to capture the interrelationships between the 3 dimensions. There's 3 different types of intellectual capital generated in the groups: knowing why, knowing what, and knowing how. And these 3 types of intellectual capital were found to impact people's willingness to engage and also their capacity to engage. And it also suggests that the outcomes of the collective action may be social or environmental. And as this research has demonstrated, although physical environmental change may not yet be occurring, the development of social capital puts groups in a position where they can prepare to engage with collective action for environmental change and accrue social benefits. I've also included the importance of time and continuity. So the red dashed lines are where groups may hit a barrier if appropriate time and continuity isn't considered. And there are several key barriers in solid red lines as well that presented an issue to the case study groups in this research. And so Nahapiet and Ghoshal's thesis that the interaction between social and intellectual capital underpins organisational advantage has been useful in exploring the preparedness of facilitation fund groups working together to deliver landscape scale improvements. I'll briefly go over my recommendations for future research and for policy practice before providing a brief conclusion. So these are my recommendations. Given the policy direction and the recognition that environmental issues transcend farm boundaries, I think it's going to be an essential research topic in the coming years. It's vital how we work out how to encourage engagement and how to support people in bringing others together to deliver landscape scale change. This presentation has focused on the social side, social and intellectual capital, but we must recognise that the way we measure environmental change must respond to the implementation of landscape scale interventions too. If we are to address environmental change, we must speak across disciplinary boundaries and examine social and natural capital together. In terms of policy and practice, with the development of the collaborative elements of Elms, it now seems more important than ever that policy pays heed to the successes of the Facilitation Fund and recognises the importance of social capital in the sustainable delivery of environmental improvements. This may include providing facilitation frameworks for practitioners who want to bring a group of farmers and land managers together to ensure they can do so in a way which encourages the development of social capital. For this, funding will be essential. And so to conclude, developing social capital is essential if we want to see improvements in natural capital. The Facilitation Fund groups I worked with were showing positive signs in moving towards being able to work together, and the intention to invest in social capital is welcomed. However, we will require specific project funding to ensure groups can deliver practical environmental change and to continue to ensure that they have an arena in which they can develop relationships, which they can have the capacity and willingness to work together. So thank you for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Amy, for this very interesting presentation, very thorough, a lot of information there. So, and quite a lot to digest. So yeah, well done for that. And maybe as far as I can see, Charlotte, I don't think there are any questions so far in the chat, but
not yet, no.
Yeah, but if anyone would like to sort of ask this question, Annie.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry. Thank you so much, Amy. That was absolutely brilliant. I'll probably come and find you later and ask you more questions. I did have a question with, obviously with building social capital, there's lots of things that you've identified that clearly have a lot of benefits and people are sort of building on, so like intellectual capital and things like that. But because you said there wasn't a lot of evidence that people were willing to work sort of on a collective landscape wide scale, is there an issue with unequal responsibility for that, for the issues being raised? So if you've got people, even if they're all full-time farmers, if they're on, say, different sizes, or if they're in different parts of, you know, the area or something. So things like, I'm just thinking about the issue with chicken farms polluting the rivers and things. If one farm is, say, slightly bigger, or some of the farmers think that they're doing sort of worse practices than another, and it's sort of, it ends up kind of being a slight blame game, and there's sort of, yeah, this sort of inequality of responsibility. Do you think that is part of the issue, why there isn't a why there isn't more interest in a sort of more collaborative landscape wide
Yeah, so I think that comes to, it comes back to kind of the importance of the facilitator role in encouraging people to understand that they will come to the events or to the group with different intentions, with different expectations. And yes, there are some people that, you know, as I mentioned, are less willing to kind of have people onto their farm because they worry about other people's perceptions.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, it comes down to developing that space and setting the expectations that, you know, we're here to discuss, we're here to improve, we're not here to criticize. And so the facilitation there is essential.
But I just mean, like, even if you have someone who knows that they're not doing the best, but they're willing to try, but they then realize that they have far more to do than somebody else, it might also put them off as well, if they think, well, I've got to do all of this, whereas you know, somebody else might not need to do quite so much, or I don't know.
Yeah, and I think as well that comes down to the uncertainty and also the funding.
Yes.
So as I mentioned at the end, it's essential that we fund people. If we want to see change, we need to fund those changes. You can't expect farmers and land managers to do it themselves. So whilst the facilitation funding has been good in that it helps people come together and to create these kind of shared expectations for their area, there wasn't any funding for delivery. So the only one group had actually received funding from the Environment Agency actually to deliver something. So without that funding, we're not going to see the delivery because it's something that just group members can't afford. So yeah, particularly, you know, you've got some people who did say to me, it feels like our backs are against the wall and we don't know how we're going to achieve this. So yeah, I suppose hopefully funding might be the answer there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Great. We have a question from Janet. So she says, you defined social capital and talked about contested definitions, but didn't do the same for intellectual capital. Is that because it just means knowledge, or is there more to it in this context?
Yeah, so intellectual capital is kind of used interchangeably with knowledge. But I think something that came out in this was the knowing why, knowing what, and knowing how. So group members need to know why they're doing something. Why am I making this change? Why is it important? You know, it might not necessarily be something that is going to be a positive for my business. So why am I doing it? How do I do it? How do I access funding for it? I think, again, it's fundamentally, how do I fund this change? And knowing what to do, you know, practically. It may be we're asking people to do something that they've never done before, adopting a completely new practice, you know, for the sake of environmental improvement. So I think it's those three elements there, and they contribute specifically to either willingness to engage and also capacity to engage with collective action.
We then just have a comment from Sophie, which is, it's really great to see Sophie's here because she's got a group. So she says, for grade and forest farmers are willing, have lots of social capital and agreement, but there is no money to deliver a project. So again, it's reiterating this issue around funding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, it was frustrating to see and to hear from group members and facilitators that they, you know, oh yeah, we know what we want to do. We just don't know how we're going to do it. We don't know where we're going to get the money from, you know, and so it was important then, and that's where I found speaking to some of the partners useful, in that they were saying, you know, having groups in this area has been really helpful for us, because we, you know, when this funding comes in, we can say, right, we'll go to this group. Or, you know, I know that in this catchment, there are these facilitation funds that we can speak to. But yeah, I completely agree. I think it's not helped either by the continued uncertainty about where funding is going to come from, what it's going to look like for groups. There's so much potential out there, and people are so willing, as Sophie says. And you know, we need to start seeing some kind of definite responses now, because otherwise people might not trust that the money is there. And as I mentioned, trust is fundamental. So if we lose that, we might lose that motivation, and then we've lost what has, been developed. And it's really important that we don't lose that. So yeah.
Great. Maybe we have a time for one more question. So I don't know whether there's anyone that would like to sort of ask the question directly. Well, if not, it's really quite a lot of information to Janet, go ahead.
Just a quickie, Amy, do you know what happens with the transition into Elm? Are facilitation projects going to continue to be available, do you know, and are they thinking about any longer timescales?
So my understanding is that facilitation funds will continue to be supported till I think 2027, and that they are hoping to have a facilitation element of Elms. I'm not sure what form that will take, but I think there is a hope that that will.
I guess within stewardship, since stewardship continues, doesn't it? Under Elm. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just a quick question around the length of funding, whether you had any differences in terms of length of funding, as well as amount that the CSFF could be funded, and whether you noticed any kind of impact on what happened on the ground. For example, the type of actions that could be taken, the time commitment from the person doing the facilitation, or things like that.
Yeah, so in terms of the individual doing the facilitation, often they found that the time they were paid for just wasn't enough. And that then obviously has implications for what they can do. A specific frustration was that they found that they couldn't engage with their groups as much as they wanted to, because there's a lot of paperwork to be done at events, and that, they felt that sometimes they couldn't get as much feedback from the group as to what they really wanted to do, because they were so focused on getting the paperwork and reporting it back to the RPA and making sure that they had receipts and everything for the events. In terms of the specific kind of individual environmental outcomes through countryside stewardship on individual farms, that's not something that I assessed. But again, I suppose I'd go back to that, as we're moving into this new kind of way of working, and particularly if we're going to be funding collective schemes, we need to have the environmental measurements that will kind of capture that. And again, I suppose to go back to, my work has focused quite heavily on the social side of things and what we can do to improve social capital, to make sure we've got sustainable relationships in which people can work together to deliver environmental improvements. But, we need that environmental monitoring as well. And I know that has been part of the reviews of the Facilitation Fund, but it was beyond the scope of the work that I did myself for my PhD.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I'm aware of the time, so I'm sorry that we'll have to sort of end this here. It's been very interesting. We will obviously post the recording online, and I think Amy would be more than happy then to answer any burning questions afterwards, either through email or any other sort of way. So thank you very much for today. Our next CCRI seminar is going to be on the 16th of March, and we will have Dr. Joanna Story from the Estonian University of Life Sciences looking at Latvian meadows and sort of more directly about the Horizon project, which is called Codex. So hope you'll be able to join us, and we'll see you next month. And thank you very much, Amy, again for a very interesting talk today. Thanks a lot, and see you soon. Bye.